Thank you, Madam Chair. On behalf of the United Food and Commercial Workers, I want to thank the Standing Committee for the opportunity to share our perspective today and for your work on this subject and for bringing further attention to this very important issue. As the Union for Canada's grocery store workers, we certainly have a number of thoughts on this topic. We're a private sector union who represents more than 160,000 grocery store workers across the country. We also represent a further 100,000 Canadians and folks aspiring to be Canadians who work in many other key sectors and other industries. But as our name suggests, the majority of our membership is directly connected to the food sector. Long story short, UFCW members work hard day in and day out to proudly feed Canadians. And as the national leader of Canada's Food Workers Union, I am both proud and concerned that our members have continued to do what they've always done through this current pandemic. Despite the clear and present risks to themselves and their families, UFCW Canada members have stepped up. They've stepped up like the frontline heroes that they've always been to help their neighbors, their country, and all of us get through this difficult time. As a result, hundreds of UFCW Canada members have fallen ill. And yes, some have died, including a father of 4, a beloved grandmother, and a young cashier with her whole life still ahead of her. The current pandemic has resulted in one positive for our frontline workers. It is the recognition that they are now receiving for the crucial work that they're doing from the general public, from public officials as yourself, and the Prime Minister, no less. This recognition of grocery workers is certainly welcome, but quite frankly, is overdue. For food workers, the premium pay is appreciated from a financial standpoint, but it's also an important symbol. It represents a heightened level of respect and acknowledgement that has long eluded this industry and the hardworking people who make it possible. As their union, we are extremely disappointed in the decisions by Canada's largest retailers and other food companies to cancel these premiums. It doesn't make sense to cancel pandemic pay when we are still experiencing a pandemic situation. And more than that, it's simply not fair. In response, UFCW has filed grievances over this issue. We have launched a national campaign to engage the public over the cancellation of pandemic pay. And we're currently at the bargaining table with our major employers to negotiate the wage increases that these food workers so desperately deserve. The fact of the matter is that this so-called premium pay must become permanent. Every Canadian has a vested interest in making sure that food workers are treated and compensated fairly. That said, I must add that safeguarding the health and safety of our UFCW Canada members and their families is a top priority. We're calling on both unionized and non-union food employers to adopt a set of standards that we have detailed with the industry and the federal government. We've made some progress on this front, but there's still much to do. I'd be happy to share and provide this information to the members of the committee. And while we welcome these hearings, I am curious as to why only Canadian grocers have been called to give presentations. I think the public would benefit from hearing from huge transnationals who operate in this space who canceled their premiums a long time earlier. And I would conclude my remarks by suggesting that greater corporate responsibility is only a part of the solution here. That broader action from all levels of government and legislative policy reform that strike a better balance between grocery workers and their corporate leaders is just as essential. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and the honorable members of this committee, and it will be my pleasure to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to start by specifically thanking all the union's members, all the grocery and retail stores employees who stayed open, active, and put themselves, their family, in the front line as we pulled back, stayed home, and we wanted to make sure that we also have the security of the food, whereas they were in the front line. And I'm glad that in some ways we managed to be able to give them the benefit, however short-lived. However, I just want to personally thank, on behalf of myself, I believe all my team members, as well as our government, thank you very much. You were instrumental. Your members were instrumental getting us to this stage, and I'm sure they remain instrumental. Having said that, I've heard a lot about pandemic is not over. So why is that pandemic acknowledgement fee of $2 per hour is being cut back? So I'm going to start by reading a statement that came from the Loblaw's chief executive officer, and I'd like to get some feedback from all of you around why would they make the statements if we believe that the pandemic is not over. So the statement from 11th of July 2020 from Loblaw's chief executive officer reads, "Finally, as the economy slowly reopens and the Canadian begin to return to work, we believe it's the right time to end the temporary pay permit we introduced at the beginning of the pandemic. Things have now stabilized on our market and on supermarkets and drugstores. After extending the premium multiple times, we are confident our colleagues now are operating on the safe and effectively a new normal." Quick question: have any of the unions and your members were consulted into the fact that the pandemic, as far as the owners are concerned, is over now? We're going to do this, or you just heard it like the rest of us?
I think that some of the summaries is very accurate. There is no doubt that the pandemic is not over. I would just like to add a couple of significant issues. That we were contacted by Loblaws to say they were going to end the pandemic pay. We're adamantly opposed to ending the pandemic pay. We made as many issues of it as we could. We also reminded them of the 20 protocols that UFCW Canada was able to put together. We're able to put it together because we're an international union. We called on the best standards from our colleagues and unions in Europe and in South America. And all of these issues would indicate that the pandemic is still ongoing, that pandemic pay should not go. UFCW's call and a letter to the employers at the beginning of April. The letter was also shared with the government, Minister Tassi and Minister Hadou, who we did speak with Minister Tassi on the issue. There's 20 protocols that we asked to be put in place for all retail foods stores, all retailers. And the one of the points on there is very clear, that the pandemic pay must stay, must become permanent, and actually must be increased.
Yeah, thank you for our witnesses. And I know it was originally, and maybe this will help clear up how we got here. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Erskine Smith, for bringing forth a motion to having the chains come forward because they were caught with collusion on bread scandal across this country from the Competition Bureau. And then I amended it to include at least some worker representation, but there's no doubt that this issue and this industry deserves more oversight and more activity, and all members have been supportive of that. So we'll see where we go forth, but this is just the first dive at this, for no doubt. First question I have is for UFCW and Unifor with regards to the chain of structures inside both the representative workers you have. I didn't realize, or is this not accurate, that your workers that are, say, for example, at Food Basics versus Metro or No Frills versus Loblaws, they're paid differently. They can be part of the same company, but they're structured so that the basic stores or the ones that are the lower end of the grocery store change in terms of their modeling pay their workers less. Is that true? So maybe I can hear from both those organizations first.
What's important for everyone to understand, as I said, the Teamsters and Unifor are aware of this as well, is that the current situation that we find ourselves in with grocery store workers, and Mr. Massey, thank you for your question because it will illustrate this, is that the downturn in the value of the work occurred in the late 80s, early 90s with the entrance of multinational Walmart. And what occurred there is, for the first time in Canada, we had a situation of a deep discount, and they paid less, they provide no benefits, and they competed with the larger chains, which have now since consolidated. Gary said earlier, there's been a huge consolidation, but they competed against what we referred to as conventional stores that had meat departments, that had bakeries, and had full service checkout people to take your groceries out to your car. And the new model from Walmart, if you remember, their slogan was always prices, the lowest price is the law, and we're price dropping. So what happened in Canada is we've seen a huge entrance into what they call discount and deep discount stores. Food basics, no frills, as you mentioned. And what occurs is they set them up to deal with these other issues. And we've seen a decline in conventional stores. So, Mass, you're absolutely correct. If you have a conventional store, like a Portino's or an Extra Foods, you'll see that those collective agreements are superior. The rates of pay and benefits are superior in those than there are to the deep discount, like the no frills and the food based.
No, there's no doubt. And we started a $15 minimum wage policy federally about 4 years ago, I think. So even that is a modest response. Here's what about really, quite frankly, upsetting to me is that I have a food basics in an area of that I represent, Windsor West, that is clearly inferior in terms of the way it's serviced and the way that it's kept and the standards it has. And what upsets me even more is hearing about this wage differential, because the people around there are also some of the workers, and it's also in one of the most disadvantaged areas or challenged areas. It's also one of the ones they know demographically is more diverse and has historical hiring issues with regards to some of the people that are there. And what really bothers me a lot about this is that the stores don't have to have a policy of paying their workers differently. That's a choice. That's a business choice deliberately by basically providing lower services, less customer availability of some products, and on top of that, knowingly have a depressed area compared to some of the other areas in the suburbs, which are actually more affluent, receive better jobs, better products, better service, and that's their business model. It's outright discrimination on some of the poorest and disadvantaged neighborhoods that we have, and it's a policy that they implement, and it's a policy they'd actually build their business on. You wonder why people get upset about this, because the kids and the part-time workers around that I've known, I used to be an appointment specialist for persons with disabilities. They're the most vulnerable in this, and you're right about the hours being set, the lack of follow-up. At any rate, this needs a lot more work than what we're doing in these committee hearings today, because there's no doubt this is a structural discrimination by the grocery store chains on some of the most disadvantaged areas. All you have to do is walk the aisles, walk the stores, see the difference. Why do some neighborhoods get treated different than other ones?
I know that Mr. Massey had indicated about the bread scandal, the collusion associated with that, and coming from a farming community, I just wanted to make the point that even if you doubled the price of bread, the farmers would only be getting a few pennies more. So there is a lot of money made in agriculture, but it's not necessarily made by farmers. And I think perhaps what I'd like to do is to talk to Mr. Lacroix as far as the Teamsters are concerned. It's been so important, to get the products to the stores, and I know that there were major issues earlier on. I know that I had spoken with a lot of people that were concerned, the truckers and so on. Just simple things like having public washrooms open, places where they could have food pickup and so on. So hopefully we've learned something from that. And I think the other thing that we can look at, and maybe for the grocery people, when we go to our local co-op or so on to pick up our groceries, we see the great effort that is being done, and we see them wiping down the equipment between every customer. We see our little dots on the floor, and people understand that if we follow that we'll be able to continue working together. And I think that's critical. So I'm not sure who it is that kind of initiated some of those things, and I'm just curious whether those were steps that the workers were helping to incorporate, and what other suggestions you might have for frontline workers, whether it be those that are on the grocery line or those that are actually getting those groceries and that food to our stores.
Early on in this pandemic, said, we put together a list with our unions around the world to the 20 best practices for retail stores that include everything you see now. Many of those came from workers, they came from unions, and some did come from the employers. We forwarded that to Minister Hadju, all the employers and all the employers that we represent as the best practices. I'm proud to say that most of them have been adopted, but not all of them. And the other part is that it's not consistent throughout.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the witnesses for your very powerful testimony. I know I speak on behalf of all my colleagues and Canadians in general when I say we owe a great debt of gratitude to essential workers during these very, very difficult times. Now, even before this pandemic, I think the topic of living wages was problematic, let alone at a time like this where a lot of employees have a lot of concerns. We heard from one of the witnesses about the number of employees that had fallen ill. Could you give us some numbers as well? Because we're all girding for the testimony we're going to be hearing from management on Friday. So it'd be very helpful if we had those numbers.
We've been as high as 60 active cases throughout Canada. We've had 4 deaths in the retail sector. We've had 2 deaths in the meat processing sector, and well over 3,000 people impacted at one point or another in the food processing sector.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Meinema, my follow-up question to you is, you said that this is an issue that you're bringing up at the bargaining table. Given the problematic living wages that a lot of employees are receiving, what is the standard response that management gives you when you raise these types of legitimate concerns? I just want to be prepared for Friday.
Well, I think the thing that they will always bring up to them is, who is their competition? What does their competition pay? Our argument back is that we believe that the system is actually flawed. The logistical system of retailing groceries is flawed. When we are all more concerned about driving lower costs, which impact the Teamsters with the trucking, which impact both Unifor, Teamsters, and UFCW with warehousing, because we have to, we end up with warehouses that are fully automated. The system itself, it's very thin margins, but I believe that the very thin margins are because of the design of the system itself to make sure that we keep thin margins. And that's where I think the government has to play a huge role in a living wage, so that if the real argument is competition, then take the non-union competition and you force them into the same situation when it comes to wages and benefits. The union members will receive more benefits overall, they'll receive a pension overall, but that all parts of it. And then, the thin margins that the retailers always talk about, I think is a flaw in the system, because that's where we're driving things to, rather than looking at increasing and improving the lot of life for workers.
Thank you very much.
A report from CTV has 2 grocery store workers in Windsor testing positive for COVID-19. That was public today from the Canadian Superstore on Walker Road in the Dougal Avenue location as well. So if anyone's said that the pandemic and the price of the work is lessened, it's not true. We all know a second wave is coming. Would more full-time positions in this industry also lessen the risk for the public and the workers if there was more permanency to those positions and routine? I'm a PSW by training. Many PSWs have to work 2 or 3 different jobs, and your heightened exposure and the risk of the people you're serving is heightened exposed because you have to hit from place to place. So my question is, that would a greater stability of full-time jobs improve not only the workers there, but also the general public with regards to safety?
Well, I can begin. Just on the sheer mathematics of it, Mr. Massey, absolutely. You have 5 people coming in doing part-time work, or 3 people coming in doing part-time work, and 1 full-time person can do that job. Clearly, that's less points of contact. So there's no doubt that just on the simple math, it would be better. On top of that, those part-time workers wouldn't go to another employer or another retailer to work as well, so they would have less contact doing that because they have 1 full-time job. And as we all know, full-time pure employment with a proper living wage would keep these folks in better shape all around. To your earlier point, Mr. Massey, of food deserts that we have and inadequate stores, the inside, a national food policy, and these types of issues will get us there. But full-time jobs will make the big difference.
My first questions will go to Mr. Meinema. Earlier, you had mentioned about the thin margins that some of the stores are reporting and about the need for a systemic change. Just for an example, so my riding here, it's 77,000 square kilometers in size. I got something like 140 different communities within their riding here. They're all very small towns. A lot of these individual small towns have their own grocery stores, and the margins are so thin that if there was a mandated minimum wage increase from where we are now to, we'll just say $15 an hour, I've had the vast majority of those store owners tell me that they would have to fire all their employees and work longer and more hours themselves as the store owners because they literally cannot afford it. So how do we address that issue and that concern going forward?
So I think that's a question that always comes up when we talk about whether it's minimum wage or raises through a collective agreement. But I think there's a bit of fallacy in that situation too. We hear that each time. We've heard it from small retailers, we've heard it from large retailers. If minimum wages go up anywhere, in the country, we're going to close the doors, we're going to lay off people. That actually doesn't occur. And what actually becomes factual is that people have more money to spend inside their community. So that will generate more income, more jobs. So I believe that it's a flaw in the system that we need to keep margins so tight that it does not allow us to provide proper compensation for people that are doing the jobs. But when we have a pandemic, they were able to. We don't see stores closing. We don't see people going out of business as a result of this portion of it. I do realize the pandemic has hurt people in other areas, but I'm talking about food retailers. And there's a number of research out there that says, look, if I knew that my grocery store person that I see every week could get a decent wage and some pension and some benefits, and I had to pay a couple cents more on a can of tuna or a can of product or for my carrots, they'd happily pay for it. And as there are a number of things that will provide better, more stability. You can talk about some of the things in the small communities that you're talking about, and as Carolyn Wright said very clearly, we have some workers in these stores that are using food banks. So we have to accept that there's a flaw in this system, that we could provide far better situation for the workers that are in there and for those small communities, because there would be more money for them to spend at other locations as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, again, going to those systemic changes here, do you have any specific suggestions that would kind of aid in that, right? I mean, it's great we're having this conversation, but outside of this pandemic, right? I think because people have been forced to stay home, if they're able to, maybe they're still working in their small town, they're not traveling abroad, so maybe right now they have potentially more to spend on food and those essentials. But outside of this, if life returns back to normal, we're going to be faced with that challenge. And especially when we have carbon taxes going up and different things like that make transit more expensive and the cost of food more expensive. What are the systemic changes that we are going to need? What are some really tangible things we can have that will help?
Well, there's been talk for a long time in Canada about a living wage. I think that's a conversation that has to seriously get some legs, as well as a guaranteed minimum income needs some legs. We're also, in my comments earlier, there has to be a full discussion between what a worker in a store makes and what a CEO makes. There needs to be a full and robust discussion of profits that these stores make as compared to what the workers in these stores make. So I think there's not one quick fix, but there is a holistic approach that needs to look at the logistics of this form of retailing that could provide a better, more stable income, not just for the workers, but for the communities that you talked about.
For sure. And I guess the big issue, again, going back to the small town model, right? I mean, again, it's not that there's a CEO structure within there, right? Because the one person is the CEO, the owner, the frontline worker, the stock person, they're doing everything because, again, those margins are just so small. So that structure per se doesn't necessarily exist. But I guess we're looking for the context of talking about Loblaws, these bigger companies. Yeah, I guess that for sure is an issue.
I would also suggest, though, that even in the small retailers, they are buying groceries from a warehouse situation They are getting advertising assistance from whether they're a franchisee. There are very few completely independent grocery operators left in Canada. They are attached to a Loblaws, they are attached to a Sobeys, they're attached to a Metro. That's where they buy their groceries from. They're attached to a federated co-op. So there still is a structure. There's very few stores left where it's just a ma-pa true operation. They're driving to the warehouse, buying and selling it in the community.
I want to stick with the UFCW. When the Hero Pay was first implemented in April, was that decision communicated to you before it was made public?
It was communicated to UFCW before it was made public. We had conversations with all three of these employers we talked about today about implementing and how it would be implemented and how we could get it done. So yes.
And did they tell you at that time why they were doing it? And if so, what did they tell you?
Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, they were doing it to recognize that there was a situation in their stores, that there was some risks involved for workers, that were in an unusual situation. There was some employment retention situation. All of these things became a part of the process. And as I said earlier in my comments, early on, UFCW worked with our international allies in finding out what are the best practices in these situations. And the COVID pay, the pandemic pay, if you will, was one of those issues.
And within a 24-hour period between June 11th and 12th, Metro, Loblaw, and Empire, which owns Sobeys, publicly announced that they were canceling the pandemic pay on the 13th. Was that communicated to you in advance as well?
I had a conversation with Loblaws in regard to ending the pandemic pay. They called to inform me that they were ending the pandemic pay. As I said, I was adamantly opposed to ending it.
When did that call take place?
Shortly before that, Mr. Erskine, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it would have been within a couple of days of that. Of them making the announcement.
But the other stores didn't communicate to you at all.
I did not have any conversations with either Metro or Sobeys.
My wife was recently on a virtual call with our doctor for a check-in for our 6-month-old, and the doctor noticed that the hearing was happening. He said, these workers are frontline workers just like I am. I'll close there. Thanks all.
Like with the CERB, was there an inadvertent, like especially looking at how we design it going forward, is there an inadvertent design flaw where we've actually got retailers saying, hey, we could use this to our advantage for profit, given the disruptions that we were already experiencing and trying to drive towards with automation? And I just find that such an interesting comment. And I think it's something that we as a committee really need to consider. I guess the other thing I would say is the leaders here, you all represent workers, especially in the processing industry. We saw so many cases of COVID. I mean, I'm from Alberta. The meat processing plants in Alberta were just a hotbed for this. And the system all ties into each other. How do we as parliamentarians come up with a set of cohesive recommendations for the broader food services industry, looking at potentially a second wave of the virus in months to come?
Well, I think what's really important in this aspect is looking at the second wave. So we represent probably 90% of the people that are in the food meat processing, if you will, industry in Canada. And we went through the situation in Cargill and in JBS, as well as Oldie Mill in Quebec, and a couple of Maple Leaf plants. I think what those protocols that were, I don't know if I can end my comments or.
Very quickly.
There are protocols in place. They need to be consistently applied to, and we have to look at the fact that people are going home to their families. These are the bread and butter jobs of food processing and retail. They interlock so much. People are going home to food processors or retail workers. That has to be watched very closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to MP Jasik. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses for making their points so very clearly. I think we're well armed for Friday when obviously the big three are going to be with us. In terms of your representation of the workers that I think we've all come to understand truly are essential workers, what can we as federal representatives on this committee actually do going forward? What kinds of recommendations can we make in terms of federal government activities? And I just wanted to start perhaps with you, Mr. Meinema. You mentioned that you're at the bargaining table. There's some talk of national health and safety standards. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on what you would like to see from a health and safety point of view?
Yes, thank you very much, Minister. We have, from the health and safety point of view, we forwarded to Minister Hadou and Minister Ashton early on in the process what needs to be done in both food processing and in the retail food sector. They are good protocols, and I would say union and non-union people alike have adopted some of them, but it's not consistent. I think where the federal government can help in both food processing and retailing is the fact that because there is money available to, whether it's the CERB or money available to the retailers or money available to food processors from the government to help them through the COVID, that they could clearly say that part of this process should be for following accepted and recommended guidelines consistently throughout the whole chain. And that, quite frankly, would save lives.
Thank you.
Now, let's kind of put some context to this, is that when COVID-19 hit, the grocery store chains were remained open. Their closest competitor is restaurants and bars and so forth, other food service, which were closed altogether, then temporarily reopened with new structured models that today are still somewhat restricted. So they had government policy that actually changed the business model in their favor. Just the reality of what it is. And we worked on, I worked extensively to try to get credit card rates lower. Some of that was done. Some of the telcos stepped up, providing freer services or expanded services. And then even Lowe's today, they're continuing with their $2 pay. I think if the grocery store chain made record profits off of this situation, they deserve a special spot and corner in hell for it, because this is the most stressful thing for people to get is food and substance and having that security. When we go back to those months of even people worried about getting into a grocery store, being in their neighborhood, losing or reducing bus service, public transportation, all those things of basic nourishment, we even saw a run on toilet paper.
That is all the time we have today. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing from the representatives of the grocery chains on Friday. With that, we call this meeting adjourned.